Good afternoon, English 108. I hope everybody out there in KVCC land is doing well. As you know, we're in our final 2 weeks of the semester, so it's time to buckle down and make sure we're where we want to be. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about the work that you're doing this week on your recommendation reports and give you a sense of how the timeline's going to work here and reflect a little bit on the audience analyses that you put together for me. So first, let's talk about the audience analysis piece. I think you guys did a really nice job overall of really interrogating who your audience is for these scenarios. I didn't put these scenarios together by accident. I tried to create audiences and purposes here that were very specific and that would challenge you to write in very specific ways. Most importantly, all of these scenarios include an audience who brings a certain set of needs and expectations and knowledge to the table. And I think in your analyses you did a very nice job of identifying what that means for us as writers. One of the ways that I like to think about this is that every reader brings sort of a different lens or different set of optics to the table to read reports or read really any type of document. And that includes any number of things. Many of the things we're not privy to. So for instance, we don't know what someone's life experience has been like, so we can't necessarily anticipate that. But we can anticipate things like their level of knowledge, and we can infer that either because they tell us so, because we have reason to believe that they have a certain level of education or familiarity with the topic. So we can make pretty good assessments about that. But even more importantly than that in some ways is what they are likely to care about. And a lot of times that has to do with their positionality, what role they play in a particular organization. So you'll see that in some of these scenarios I was very strategic in thinking about who you were writing to. So if you're writing in the tablet scenario, you're not just writing to anybody. You're not writing to some generic fictional character. You're writing to a superintendent of schools. And in so doing, you have very specific buttons that you have to press. So you're not writing to the IT director, which would be a different lens or set of optics. You're writing to the superintendent. And the superintendent has a different position, a different way of seeing things, a different set of responsibilities. And those are the things that you really have to address in your report. Likewise, in other reports, like in the welding scenario, you are writing not to the CEO, not to the head engineer. You're writing to the chief financial officer. So you're not writing to the quality control director, you're not writing to the shop foreman, you are writing to the person who at the end of the day balances the books. And what that means is that person is probably bringing a very specific lens to this document. They're not looking for certain things, they are looking for very specific things. In this case, everything probably has to tie back to the bottom line. Now that doesn't mean things like quality don't matter, but you have to talk about quality within the context of the things that do matter, money. So if you want to talk about the quality of the weld, for instance, you should tie that back to the bottom line that this reader cares about. So each of you in your scenarios will have some bottom line that you're trying to address, or you'll have a unique set of considerations that you have to make about that particular audience. And I've built that into those scenarios. And so the more critically you think about that, and the more time you spend analyzing these specific needs, and what this does and where this manifests is in terms of the content that you include. It manifests in terms of the order in which you present content. It matters in terms of how much time and energy and space you devote to particular types of content. So that audience analysis piece is really crucial here because it allows you to align the reports, every decision that you make within that report to that specific audience. And that's why I had you do that. And I think that that's a good lesson and a good course of action, a good best practice, and a good habit of mind for you to have is anytime you sit down to write something, especially a longer form report, you need to think and really assess who your audience is. And so that's why we did that. And I hope that what that does is gives you a really clear sense, a really clear bearing. It's kind of like a compass, and it gets you pointed in the right direction. So I hope you keep that in mind. So now that you have that squared away and you've spent some time thinking about your audience and how that's going to manifest itself in your reports, now presumably you're in the phase of actually collecting information, and compiling the report. And that's what we're principally going to spend this week on. And this week we don't have a lot of other things on our agenda other than just kind of putting our butts in the chairs and working on this, because I realize this is a pretty time-consumptive process. You're going to have to think, for instance, about the best way to allow for comparisons between the options. You're going to have to think about the best way to depict the data, to demonstrate or assess the criteria. So there's a lot of thinking and a lot of learning that's going to be involved in actually just compiling the report, which is why I don't feel compelled to pile on anything else. So that's really what we're going to be up to this week. You'll notice that there are a couple of requirements of the actual report that we haven't covered yet, but I'm going to keep them as straightforward as possible. As far as the cover page goes, it just needs to have the title of the report and your name. It doesn't have to be fancy. If you want to make it look fancy, that's fine with me. It just needs to look professional and needs to contain the information somebody would need so they could locate the report. I also want you to have a table of contents which corresponds directly and nicely and accurately with the various sections of your report, depending on how you choose to break it up and compartmentalize information. And then I'm going to ask that you write an executive summary. And an executive summary is a really important part to these longer reports. So if you take that word, that phrase executive summary, and you break it into its constituent parts, there's two words there, executive and summary. Summary is pretty easy. We're taking something larger and we're making it smaller without sacrificing the integrity of the information. So we're trying to encapsulate the core messaging of a particular document. And you'll do this from time to time, and summarizing is an important skill because you have to balance depth and breadth. So you want to be sure to include everything, but you don't want to do it at the expense of being too long-winded. So in that way, writing a summary of any type, especially an executive summary, you'll be practicing writing concisely and thinking carefully about every letter, every word, every sentence that you put on the page. But the second word there is also very important, and that's executive. And executive summaries are traditionally parts of longer reports, and they're written with an executive in mind, a chief officer within an organization or a company, somebody who is very busy, who may have to read lots of these reports and make decisions rapidly. And so your goal, in about 10 to 20% of the overall length of the report, it's always good to shoot on the more concise side if you can, and you can do that in a number of different ways. In about 10 to 20% of the original report, you want to provide an overview of all the report in its entirety. It's kind of like the Cliff's Notes version. But remember, you have to kind of tell the whole story. So you're going to want to think really carefully about how you put that together. In other words, you should feel comfortable that if somebody just read the executive summary, they would draw the same conclusion as if they read the whole report. So, and I want you to keep that in mind because that will probably dictate how you approach writing your executive summary. So you're going to have to write that, and that's going to be good practice for the reasons that I just established. So my hope is that by the end of this week, I'll be able to take a look at where you're at with that report and offer you some feedback. Now, here's what I'll say to those of you who watch this video, and I'm not convinced that everybody does, but this is a shout out to the people who do watch regularly. And this will hopefully make the end of your semester a little less stressful and hectic. I want you to treat your draft that you're submitting me like a final draft. And I want you to do that for a very particular reason. And that's because if it's adequate, that is, if you check off all the boxes, if you have thought carefully about your audience, if you've provided information so your audience can make useful comparisons between options, if you make a compelling and useful recommendation that is well supported, that is, you make claims and support them with clear evidence, and you do this well, and you knock it out of the park because you spent time on it, you put yourself through the feedback loop before my having ever seen it, and you do that and you do well, I will give you a provisional grade. What I mean by that is, if you submit a draft and it is an A as it sits, I will tell you that immediately. That way you don't have to revise unnecessarily. Likewise, if you submit something and it's a B, I will tell you that it is a B. And if you're comfortable with that and happy with that and it doesn't impact your overall grade too much, then you're done. Okay? Now, that being said, if you submit me something and it's not where it needs to be, I'll still give you a provisional grade. I'll say at this moment right now this would be in the D range or the C range or what have you. I'll give you revision ideas or suggestions for improvement, and then you'll have until the end of week 15 to submit in a final draft form. What this essentially does is takes the onus and puts it on you, but it gives you the opportunity, if you spend the time in week 14, to really think carefully about this and construct a useful, well-conceived, well-supported report, you'll have the opportunity basically maybe to have week 15 largely to yourself and not have to worry too much about English 108. That said, there is a small reflective writing assignment in week 15 that I ask everybody to do. It's very similar to what you did at the beginning of the semester, in the middle of the semester, where you basically tell me what you learned from the class, which is always a good moment for me because I like to see what folks are picking up. But again, this is a capstone assignment. I'm looking for you to put everything into play that we've been working on, so be mindful of jargon, think carefully about your formatting, try to implement crap as you see fit, try to think carefully about the level of information you provide, think about how you allocate space in the document, try to focus on the things that are most important, try not to include extraneous information. But generally try to provide a useful document that your specific reader could use to make an informed decision. If you do that, I promise you'll do well. If you need any help with anything that's going on in the class, I urge you to contact me. I have a pretty open week this week. I'm happy to meet with you and work with you in any capacity that you need me to, so keep that in mind. And then just one sort of housekeeping issue here. I'm mostly caught up on grades in this class. I have a few final fact sheets to work on and a few revisions, and then some homework type assignments that I need to return to you. But you should have a pretty good sense at this point what your current grade is, and you'll see that in Blackboard called your current grade, and it'll be a percentage out of 100. I ask you to compare that to the grading schedule that is posted on the syllabus, and that will give you a good sense of what your corresponding letter grade is. Again, I want to be an open book about grades, so if you have any questions or concerns about your standing in the class, all you have to do is send me a quick email, and I'm happy to go over that. If you're not satisfied with your place in the class right now in terms of your grade, I'm happy to talk to you about options for revising and improving that grade. That's one of the beautiful things about writing, is that you can continuously improve the document until it is where it needs to be. Writing, again, is never done. It's just due. And in this case, we can be a little bit flexible with the due dates. So anyway, I digress. Please let me know if you need any help. And otherwise, I'll talk to you in week 15.